I am deeply aware of this.
King Charles believed the locked cabinet contained nothing more dangerous than forgotten correspondence. Then he saw Diana's handwriting. The envelope was still sealed. Prince William's name was written across the front, and Princess Anne's private mark appeared beside it. Within minutes, Charles had summoned his sister and cleared the room. What he had discovered was not merely a message from the past. It was a secret deliberately kept from a future king. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles stood in Windsor Castle, turning the cream-colored envelope between his fingers. The restricted review had begun as an examination of private royal correspondence transferred after Queen Elizabeth II's death. But this was no ordinary file. Private royal correspondence meant personal letters preserved within the monarch's controlled archives, documents rarely exposed to relatives. Across the front, Diana had written, "For William, when the crown becomes heavier than the truth." The words struck him hard. They suggested she had expected a day when her son would face not only duty, but a brutal conflict between conscience and the institution he was born to inherit. Then he noticed Anne's small mark on the back. The symbol confirmed that his sister had guarded the message for decades without telling him. Humiliation followed shock. She had protected Diana's warning, while allowing her brother to believe no such secret existed. Charles sent every aide away and ordered Anne brought to him. When Princess Anne entered, she saw the envelope beside his hand and stopped before reaching the chair. Her face tightened, yet she did not look surprised. She looked like someone watching an old promise rise from the grave. The king asked whether she had read it. Anne refused to answer. He asked why it had been hidden from William, and she remained silent long enough for suspicion to become fear. A handwritten notation on the seal stated that delivery must wait until the prince faced a direct clash between his father and the monarchy's future. The crown, in this warning, meant more than a jeweled object. It meant the authority, duties, and pressures surrounding the sovereign. Charles set the letter down, but his hand stayed over it. He now feared Diana had foreseen a crisis involving him. Anne stepped closer and told him discovery did not create ownership. The message belonged neither to the archives nor to the monarch. Its fate belonged to William. But before Charles could confront what Diana may have written, he first had to confront the three people bound together by a wound the monarchy had never truly healed. The letter carried Diana's handwriting, but its true weight rested on three living hearts. Charles saw a challenge to his authority. Anne saw a promise she had sworn never to betray. William stood unknowingly at the center, still carrying the memory of a mother whose final guidance had been hidden from him. Before the envelope could be opened, every old loyalty inside the royal family would be forced into the light. Charles moved toward the window, but distance did nothing to calm him. He and Anne had been shaped by the same demanding childhood, yet they had survived it in opposite ways. The king needed reassurance that duty and family still stood behind him, while his sister trusted silence, discipline, and promises kept, even when they caused pain. The Princess Royal, a title given to the monarch's eldest daughter, had built her life around service without emotional display. That strength now felt to her brother like cold defiance. He turned and asked whether she had spent all these years believing Diana's judgment mattered more than his own. Anne felt anger rise, but her voice remained controlled. She reminded him that the message had not been entrusted to an institution. It had been given by a mother who feared her son might one day be forced to choose between his conscience and the crown. William's relationship with his father had grown stronger through shared duties, family losses, and the pressure of preparing for the future. Yet Diana remained the private boundary between them, a memory the monarch could acknowledge but never fully enter. Anne finally explained, through the documented instructions Diana had left with the sealed envelope, why she had been chosen. The late princess believed her former sister-in-law would resist courtiers, advisors, and even the sovereign himself if the conditions for delivery had not been met. The sovereign meant the reigning king or queen, the person who formally stands at the head of the monarchy. Charles absorbed the insult behind that choice. Diana had trusted Anne's resistance more than she had trusted his restraint. His sister then revealed that the timing depended on a future act by him, one capable of placing royal control above William's moral freedom. Elsewhere, the prince received a brief message requesting his immediate presence at Windsor. He read the unusually formal wording twice, set down his phone, and felt an old unease return. No explanation had been offered, but he knew the summons carried something deeper than routine duty. As William began the journey, Anne faced her brother and warned him that their conflict had not started with the discovery of the envelope. It had started on one night neither of them had ever dared to discuss openly. That night had been buried beneath ceremonies, funerals, and decades of royal silence. Yet it was the precise moment Diana decided her son would one day need protection from the crown itself. Years before the sealed envelope appeared on Charles's table, Diana had already imagined the danger waiting for William. It happened after a private family dinner that ended with raised voices behind a closed door and a young prince standing alone in a corridor. That was the night Diana sought out Anne, placed a handwritten message into her hands, and demanded a promise that would eventually turn sister against brother. The fear had been growing for months. Diana watched William learn that royal peace often depended on swallowing honest feelings, and she feared every lesson in obedience was teaching him to mistrust his own conscience. The monarchy's stability meant preserving public confidence and avoiding family conflict that could weaken the institution, but she believed that stability became dangerous when it demanded silence from a child. Anne understood that danger differently. She had never been Diana's closest companion, yet the princess respected her because she spoke plainly, rejected false affection, and never changed her answer merely to satisfy palace expectations. Everything finally broke after a private dinner at Balmoral. The Scottish royal estate served as the family's secluded summer residence, where personal conversations could happen beyond public scrutiny. Charles became furious when his teenage son questioned a decision concerning his future duties in front of family advisors. The father told William sharply that he must never challenge a future sovereign in such company again. The young prince left the room shaken, his face burning with shame. Diana found him alone near the staircase, struggling to hold back tears. She expected fear of punishment, but what she heard was worse. William worried that becoming king might mean surrendering the right to say when something felt wrong. His mother comforted him, yet the words stayed with her. Later that night, Diana approached Anne privately and repeated the conversation in a documented account she asked her former sister-in-law to preserve. She said William might always love his father, but love could not be allowed to destroy his courage to oppose him. Then she produced the sealed letter. It was to remain unopened until Charles made a decision capable of defining his son's reign before it had begun. Anne asked why Diana could not protect the message herself. She answered that a secret kept by its author could be lost, removed, or dismissed, but a promise held by Anne would survive royal pressure. The older woman placed her hand over the envelope and gave her word. Diana released it slowly, surrendering what felt like her final protection for William. Back in the present, Anne faced Charles and confirmed that his undisclosed decision had fulfilled the condition for delivery. The revelation changed Charles's anger into alarm, because Anne was no longer defending a memory. She was accusing the king of becoming the very danger Diana had predicted. Charles closed the door himself. No aides remained, no private secretary stood nearby, and no royal protocol could soften what followed. On the table between brother and sister lay Diana's sealed warning, untouched, but powerful enough to tear open grievances neither had spoken aloud. Charles demanded loyalty. Anne demanded honesty. And for the first time, the king was forced to hear why his own sister believed Diana had been right to fear him. He had recently prepared a private constitutional directive designed to preserve his influence over decisions William would inherit during the transition to a future reign. A constitutional directive was a formal royal instruction shaping how authority, appointments, and policy would continue beyond the present monarch. To Charles, it protected stability. To Anne, it chained a future sovereign to choices he had never freely made. The document would keep trusted appointments in place and make it harder for William to reverse key decisions once he became king. That mattered, because a reign begins with more than a crown. It begins with the freedom to choose what kind of monarch to become. Charles accused his sister of standing beside him at ceremonies while secretly guarding Diana's judgment against him. Anne pushed her chair back and remained standing. She told him loyalty did not mean helping a brother control his son from beyond his own reign. The words landed harder than any public criticism could have done. He had spent years proving his devotion to duty, yet she was now suggesting that devotion had become fear, disguised as responsibility. Charles struck his palm against the table and demanded the envelope. Anne placed one hand over it. "You may be king, but this was never yours." Silence followed, sharp and unforgiving. The monarch asked whether she had read Diana's message. His sister answered through the documented account attached to the envelope. She had read only the separate instruction written for its guardian. That instruction stated that the letter must be delivered if Charles ever tried to predetermine William's major decisions before the younger man's reign began. The king's expression changed. Anne knew about the directive, even though it had not received formal approval. Someone inside his closest circle had warned her. He demanded a name, but she refused to offer one. The argument was no longer only about Diana or an old family wound. It was now about trust collapsing inside the king's own household. Charles asked whether William had already been told. Anne looked directly at him and answered with 4 words: "He is on his way." In that instant, both understood the next battle. Whoever reached the prince first might shape how he saw the letter, the directive, and his father. Yet the sealed letter was only one source of power inside Windsor. And before William arrived, the hidden machinery surrounding Charles's directive began moving against Anne. A royal argument rarely remains private once power is threatened. While Charles and Anne faced each other behind closed doors, secretaries began making calls, files were removed from desks, and a carefully prepared directive suddenly became the most dangerous document in the palace. Anne had Diana's envelope, but Charles possessed the machinery of the crown, and that machinery could isolate even the strongest member of the family before sunset. Senior advisors had shaped the constitutional directive around one belief: William must inherit a settled structure rather than begin his reign by tearing apart everything his father had built. The directive, a formal royal instruction designed to preserve appointments and guide future decisions, was presented as continuity. Yet its private clauses told a harsher story. Several of Charles's chosen officials would remain in place for years, and the future king would be expected to consult the old circle before reversing major policies. Anne held no formal power over the document, but her reputation for duty and her influence with William could destroy its moral legitimacy. Charles's private secretary quietly advised him to remove his sister from all consultations until the crisis passed. A private secretary is the senior official who manages a royal figure's work, advice, and confidential communication. The recommendation forced the king toward a brutal choice: trust Anne despite her defiance, or use royal authority to silence her before William arrived. He approved the first restriction without meeting her eyes. Minutes later, she received notice that a scheduled briefing had been cancelled. Anne read the message twice. No accusation appeared, yet its meaning was unmistakable. Her brother had begun turning the institution against her. Alone in an adjoining room, she removed her glasses and pressed her fingers against her eyes. Hurt broke through for only a moment. She had defended Charles through public storms, family fractures, and years of criticism, but now he treated her loyalty as a threat because it refused to become obedience. Then a confidential draft reached her through an encrypted palace message. Its clauses confirmed her fear. William's future reign would begin under appointments he had not chosen, and limits he had never accepted. The sender was not a rebellious courtier, it was Camilla. The queen consort, the reigning king's wife, held no sovereign power herself, but lived close enough to see the fear driving him. She called Anne directly, and spoke through a private recorded conversation, preserved by a trusted aide. Charles was not acting from cruelty, she said. He was terrified that his son would dismantle everything he had spent a lifetime building. Anne replied that fear did not make control harmless. Before Camilla could answer, footsteps approached the adjoining room. A secretary entered with a formal order. The king wanted Diana's sealed envelope transferred into official custody. When Charles tried to turn Diana's final message into crown property, the dispute ceased to be a family disagreement, and the first irreversible consequence followed immediately. The command was delivered in calm language, but everyone understood its meaning. Anne was to surrender Diana's letter before William reached Windsor. A security officer waited outside. A private secretary held out a document authorizing the transfer. For one suspended moment, the Princess Royal stared at the paper, then at the sealed message in her hand. Charles had chosen authority over trust, and the palace began dividing around that choice. The king had ordered the envelope placed in secure royal custody until legal advisors decided whether private correspondence involving an heir could be delivered without official review. Secure royal custody meant controlled storage under palace authority, where access could be restricted until senior officials approved its release. To some staff, the decision protected the monarchy from an unknown document capable of influencing a future sovereign. To others, it was an attempt to seize a dead mother's words before they reached her son. Anne closed the document without signing it. She told the officer she would surrender every royal duty she held before breaking the promise attached to the envelope. Her position mattered because decades of service had made her one of the most trusted figures in the family. Yet that trust now placed her directly against the monarch. The officer did not move, neither did she. When news of the refusal reached Charles, he stood alone in his study and closed his eyes. Grief struck before anger could return. His sister was prepared to risk their relationship rather than believe he would treat William fairly. Camilla entered moments later and found him tearing the unsigned transfer order in half. For one breath, she thought regret had won. Then he asked for another copy. The queen consort, the reigning monarch's wife, without independent sovereign authority, watched pride rebuild the wall that pain had briefly broken. Elsewhere, Anne examined the papers attached to the order and discovered something crucial. The constitutional directive had not yet been signed. Until the king added his signature, the plan could not become binding policy. Charles could still withdraw it before William learned how close his future had come to being restricted. The security officer lowered his gaze and quietly stepped away instead of enforcing the transfer. That single choice gave Anne time to place the envelope inside her document case and leave. William's car entered the Windsor grounds as she crossed the corridor. The prince had received no explanation, but the silence surrounding his arrival told him this was no ordinary family meeting. Anne gripped the case while Charles watched from the far end without calling after her. She reached William first, changed direction, and led him away from the official chamber into a small private room where no advisor could follow. With the doors closed and the crown temporarily left outside, William would finally learn what his mother had preserved for him, and what his father had nearly taken away. There was no throne, no red box, and no advisor waiting to explain what William should feel. Only Anne, a sealed envelope, and the handwriting he had not seen in years. She placed Diana's message before him and told him the truth without decoration. His father had found it, tried to secure it, and now stood one decision away from shaping William's reign before it began. Then Anne left the choice entirely to him. William listened as she described the promise made after the Balmoral dinner, when Diana had seen her son frightened by the idea that duty might one day silence his conscience. The red box, a locked case used to carry official royal papers, was absent because this was not state business. It was a mother's warning, protected until the future king's independence faced a real threat. Anne then showed him the unsigned directive. Its terms would preserve Charles's appointments for years and force consultation before major changes could be made. William understood immediately that this was not about one advisor or one policy. It was about whether his reign would begin freely or beneath restrictions inherited from his father. Anger tightened inside him. He felt betrayed that Anne had kept the letter hidden for so long, Yet he also knew delivering it earlier would have broken Diana's exact condition and turned private grief into a weapon before it was needed. His feelings toward Charles became even harder to separate. Part of him wanted to confront the king for trying to control a future that was not his to govern. Another part saw the fear beneath the directive, the terror of becoming irrelevant, and watching a lifetime of work disappear the moment his son took the throne. Anne slid a letter opener across the table. With no aides present, William touched his mother's handwriting and asked whether opening the envelope would destroy what remained between him and his father. He broke the seal. Diana's written message, preserved in the documented letter before him, contained no attack on Charles. She urged her son not to inherit anyone's fear, including her own, and told him to forgive his father without surrendering the freedom to make moral choices. Love, she warned, becomes control when obedience is demanded as proof of loyalty. William read those lines twice. Then he folded the message carefully and returned it to the envelope. He told Anne he would face Charles alone, not as an heir challenging a monarch, but as a son speaking to his father. Carrying Diana's words and the unsigned directive, he entered the study prepared to force a final choice between legacy and family. What happened in that room would not remain hidden, because by morning, one image outside Windsor would reveal to the world that the monarchy had survived a reckoning from within. By sunrise, Britain knew something extraordinary had happened at Windsor. The palace issued no detailed statement, yet silence only sharpened the public's attention. Then one photograph appeared: Charles, William, and Anne, leaving a private chapel together, their expressions solemn, Diana's cream envelope visible in William's hand. In a single frame, decades of grief, loyalty, and royal conflict became impossible to hide, and the nation immediately chose what it believed the moment represented. Hours later, the palace confirmed that Charles had withdrawn the proposed directive, and that William would retain complete freedom over appointments and priorities during his future reign. A royal directive was a formal instruction intended to shape decisions inside the monarchy, and withdrawing it meant the plan could no longer bind the next sovereign. Officials refused to discuss Diana's letter, but the envelope in the prince's hand connected the family's private reckoning to his mother's enduring influence. The king felt exposed as commentators declared that her warning had defeated him. William saw something different. He feared his father's reversal would be treated as humiliation when it had required the courage to surrender control before the whole institution turned against him. Anne watched reporters praise her defiance, yet she felt no victory. Protecting Diana's promise had nearly destroyed her bond with Charles, and public applause could not erase the moment her brother had looked at her as though decades of loyalty meant nothing. Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds gathered beneath the gates while newspaper copies passed from hand to hand. One front page carried the photograph above a blazing headline, "Diana's words free William." Some cheered the future king's independence. Others fell silent at the sight of the envelope, understanding that a mother lost years earlier had somehow reached into the present and altered the course of the crown. A national broadcaster described the crisis through a recorded morning report as the night a king chose his son over his control. The framing changed the mood. Charles's retreat was no longer presented only as defeat, it became an act of painful sacrifice. Then the palace released one final detail. The monarch had personally ordered the withdrawn directive destroyed in William's presence, ensuring no advisor could revive it later. Camilla found Charles watching the coverage alone. The queen consort reached for the remote, but he stopped her and said he needed to hear how the country had judged him. She remained beside him as praise and criticism arrived in equal measure. Public opinion had delivered its interpretation, but the final verdict belonged elsewhere, to Charles, Anne, and William, and to the private choice they still had to make about Diana's words. Beyond the headlines and cheering crowds, 3 members of one wounded family still had to decide whether Diana's letter would remain a weapon from the past or become the beginning of peace. The final meeting contained no accusations. The directive was gone, Diana's message had reached its intended recipient, and every person in the room understood what the confrontation had cost. Charles could not undo the years that made the letter necessary. Anne could not erase the pain caused by keeping it hidden. William could not recover the mother who wrote it. But together, they could decide whether her warning ended in division or wisdom. William had asked his father and aunt to meet privately after the public reaction faded. He refused to let the envelope become a permanent symbol of one royal defeating another, because victory built on family humiliation would only create a new wound. The future sovereign, meaning the person next in line to become monarch, explained that Diana had not ordered him to reject Charles. She had asked him to separate love from unquestioning obedience. The king finally admitted what had driven the directive. He feared his son would erase his work, reject his judgment, and allow history to define his reign only by its failures. Anne listened without interrupting. Then she admitted that protecting the message had hardened her toward her brother. She had mistaken silence for strength, even when an honest conversation years earlier might have prevented the crisis. Charles lifted the unsigned directive from the table and carried it to the fireplace. A directive was a formal instruction intended to guide royal decisions, but without his signature, this one had never gained binding force. He placed the pages into the flames and watched until the final sheet curled into ash. William closed Diana's envelope and set it between all three of them rather than keeping it on his side. The gesture changed everything. He declared that the letter would remain private and would never be used to shame his father. His mother's final lesson had been freedom, guided by compassion, not revenge disguised as justice. Charles restored Anne's role in family consultations, and later affirmed through a formal palace statement that the future king must be trusted to govern according to his own conscience. Before leaving, the monarch thanked his sister for keeping a promise he had once mistaken for betrayal. She took his hand briefly and told him that protecting William had ultimately protected him as well. The confrontation proved that the monarchy survives, not by hiding every fracture, but by allowing power to yield to truth. Parents must release their children. Loyalty must permit disagreement. Diana's sealed message did not overthrow Charles or divide him from William. It freed both men from repeating the same wound and transformed Anne's secret burden into reconciliation. And so the message Diana entrusted to Anne reached William exactly when it was needed. Not to break a king, but to teach a father to let go, a son to forgive, and a monarchy to move forward without denying the pain that shaped it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.